This is Mike Tatarski, host of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, coming to you from my home in Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam. The Mekong River and its delta have fascinated me ever since I moved here in late 2010. Perhaps there's something about growing up in New Orleans that draws me to great rivers. The delta, of course, is easily accessible from here, and I've always enjoyed being able to simply see the river on trips to Cambodia and Laos, particularly as I got into environmental reporting 7-ish years ago. The delta took on even greater significance for me. I've written about the region numerous times through both field and desk reporting over time, while also keeping an eye on developments further upstream, all of which are fascinating and frequently concerning, as you'll hear. Again, I mean, perhaps there's some innate connection between where I grew up, a city located where it really shouldn't be, increasingly exposed to climate change, and other forces beyond its control, also some forces under its control not being properly addressed. Today's guest is Brian Eiler, director of the Southeast Asia Program and the Energy, Water, and Sustainability Program at the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. He's also the author of the excellent 2019 book, Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, which I reviewed back when I was at Saigoneer. His team also runs the Mekong Dam Monitor, which we talk about, which is satellite-based program. So Brian's an invaluable expert on the river, and we discussed quite a few topics. The proposed Funan Techo Canal in Cambodia, a new dam that China has not announced the completion of, the role of Laos in the river's declining health, how the satellite-based dam monitor I just mentioned is doing a job that regional governments should really be doing, the existential problems facing the Delta here in Vietnam, and what can be done to ensure that these are not indeed the Mekong's last days of might. This is the first of several episodes about the river and the Delta that I plan to record in the coming months. Again, this is a topic that really hits home for me, even though I'm not from here. And I think Brian provides an outstanding big picture assessment of one of the world's great rivers. So let's get to our conversation. Brian, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Hey, it's great to be here, Mike.
We've been in touch off and on over the years. I read your book a while back, I think back in 2020, and always interested in your work at the Stimson Center and with Mekong Dam Monitor. But I wanted to start kind of not far from here in Ho Chi Minh City in Cambodia with this Funan Techo Canal, which I'll admit only came on my radar a couple months ago. Hasn't been in the news very much here in Vietnam, perhaps unsurprisingly. But could you kind of explain what is this planned canal?
Yeah, it's kind of the sleeper issue in the region right now, and certainly deems more media attention and scholarly attention and attention from governments in the region. It's a canal that, on its face, doesn't look like a bad idea for Cambodia. At least that's what I thought when I first read about it. It's a canal that links the Mekong at Phnom Penh to Cambodia's coast. So if you think about the map, Cambodia has no rivers that flow from its interior to the ocean. And at the same time, Cambodia is a major manufacturing exporter, and a lot of those clothes that are made in Phnom Penh have to get to global markets. So they're packed onto container cargo ships and floated down the Mekong through Vietnam, where they're taken off boats and transshipped onto ocean-bound cargo vessels that get distributed all over the world. So this canal would reduce both the time to the ocean and then reduce the need for Cambodia's ships to go through Vietnam. So economically, kind of from an economic strategy point of view, it makes a lot of sense for Cambodia. Mm-hmm. But I have many worries about the canal.
Yeah, what are those worries?
Well, like I said, at the get-go, it kind of sounds like a good idea. And so little is known about this canal, though. Mm-hmm. It's 180 kilometers long. Really, the only thing we can draw on are a few English language media releases in the Cambodia media, and then a notification document provided from the Cambodian government to the Mekong River Commission, which is the proper thing to do.
Sorry, if I could just stop you there for a second. Sure. What is the Mekong River Commission? What's their role?
Yeah, we're going to talk a lot about the Mekong River Commission and the MRC today. We'll
Mm,
call it the MRC. This is an intergovernmental body that's made up of the member countries of Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. It started in 1995, and it is a river basin organization that is tasked to oversee the quote unquote sustainable development of the region. And there are protocols that are set forth in this 1995 agreement that whenever any country, a member, one of those four member countries, um, does something to the mainstream that affects its flow, those member countries are required to notify the Mekong River Commission.
mm,
And Cambodia did this, but they did it in the wrong way.
mm,
And this is kind of the heart of my concern because countries are starting to not follow the letter of this 1995 Mekong Agreement. And if you don't follow what you signed up for, then the whole value and the promise of this international treaty starts to erode.
mm,
So the canal is kind of part of that. The canal, the way that the Cambodians are treating the Mekong Agreement and the canal, I would argue is a major erosion of the international agreement. And it only takes a few more of these kind of negligent actions to really make the whole agreement meaningless. But to be specific, the Cambodian government again did the right thing. They did notify, but they called this canal a tributary project. Now it's not a tributary project because it connects to the Mekong mainstream on two channels. One, the main river channel that's known as the Mekong mainstream, and two, the Basak channel, which runs from Phnom Penh also all the way down through Vietnam's delta.
mm,
And then the canal continues on towards the ocean and connects to the ocean in the Gulf of Thailand at Kep, not far from Sihanoukville. And since it connects to the mainstream, sorry we get into the details, but details matter. It
yeah.
takes water from the mainstream, and it impacts the mainstream. And because of that, it requires a full notification as a mainstream Mekong project. And when that happens, then the whole set of activities come together that are facilitated by the Mekong River Commission. And all the project documents come to light. The whole region has a conversation about the canal. They get to understand its impacts. There's a technical review that will be done by experts that will, show how to mitigate some of the environmental impacts, improve the economic benefits. But none of that's happening. And because none of that is happening, because of this improper notification, the canal is very much in the dark.
And I mean, what kind of stage has it been fully approved? I mean, I know there's talk of
Mm.
potential Chinese financing, but do we know at what stage of development it may be at?
Right. Good question. It's been fully approved by the Cambodian government. It was first approved, and then because it was approved, the notification to the Mekong River Commission happened.
Mm,
It was approved a few months before Prime Minister Hun Sen left power in August of last year. The notification actually happened before he left, a few weeks before his son, Hun Manet, took
mm,
power. So it's very much one of these, let's get it approved before the new government, quote unquote, new government takes power. Um,
right.
and and indeed, it does very much look like a Chinese structured project. And most of the benefits are going to flow to Chinese actors and stakeholders and business interests, and not to
Mm,
Cambodians, and definitely not to the Vietnamese. It's been described as a BOT project, and again, getting into some details, but this is also important
mm,
because it details how the Chinese benefit more than the Cambodians. There's a lot of rhetoric out there about China's debt diplomacy, debt trap diplomacy, and
mm,
early criticisms of this canal within Cambodia said something like, "Oh well, if China's going to build this canal, or if we're going to build this canal in Cambodia, we're going to have to take on a lot of sovereign debt and owe the Chinese." BOT project actually doesn't indebt you or your country to another lender because the construction company takes on all the risk.
right. And
Um,
that's build,
and
operate, transfer, right?
right, BOT
Yeah.
means build, operate, transfer. So that
Mm,
construction company will take on the loans.
Mm-hmm.
And it hasn't been declared yet, but I bet my salary that it's going to be a Chinese, one of the big Belt and Road companies that get the Belt and
Mm-hmm.
Road contracts, and not just one company, but a handful of companies, because there's so much that goes into building a 180-kilometer long canal, in addition to the port facilities at Kep. Um, the Kep is like a tourist town.
Mm-hmm.
It's been described to me as a backwater. I think it's a beautiful setting. I don't know if I'd go that far, but there certainly isn't a lot of concrete poured there. And
Mm.
to establish a deep water port that allows for the transshipment of goods, again, you got to take the stuff off of a cargo barge and put it onto one of those large container ships, ocean-bound container ships. So there's got to be a huge port facility built there. Obviously, the Chinese construction interests are just salivating over this opportunity,
Mm.
but the the ultimate owners of the canal will be that construction company. They're going to get income from the project for 20, 30 years. The income won't flow to Cambodia or Cambodian interests.
Mm.
And that's done so that the investor can, make good on their investment and make money off of it. But it's not
Right,
going to
right.
go to Cambodia.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, certainly not downstream to Vietnam, which is where, if this were built, the impacts, I suppose, would really be felt. I assume there would be some maybe financial impact, for ports here that
Right.
take these vessels. But obviously, the larger issue would potentially be environmental. I know Hun Manet visited Hanoi a couple months ago to meet with the Vietnamese government, and I think kind of reassure Vietnamese officials that this would be not an environmental issue, but what are the environmental concerns potentially?
So first of all, yeah, the economic benefits are going to transfer to non-Vietnamese people. So any income that was earned by Vietnamese actors or companies is going to be lost. So there are some economic interests in Vietnam that are going to lose on this. But I don't think it's a concern of a few private sector individuals in Vietnam, but I don't think that's the major concern of say, the Vietnamese government.
Yeah.
The environmental impacts are going to be profound. They're transboundary in nature. And then there are other logistical impacts too of having these new ports being built on your coastline or close to your coastline, say Vietnam's coastline. I think Vietnam was already very much concerned about the buildup of the Chinese naval facility at Ream
Hmm.
and implications of that, because that facility kind of points directly at Phu Quoc Island, an island that the Khmer people, call is once as their own.
Hmm.
Probably wouldn't mind having that back. And things can get contentious pretty fast. But let's focus on the environmental impacts. This canal, one, I've read the project document, and they're going to put locks and gates into the system across this
Hmm.
180-kilometer long canal. And if those are properly managed, then the impacts to the Mekong mainstream will be minimal. It's not going to rob water from the Mekong mainstream. That was my first big concern. If you just kind
Hmm.
of cut a new river into the Mekong that goes to the ocean, well, the river's going to find a new path to the ocean, and that's going to
Right.
impact Vietnam downstream. But if they manage this properly, it won't. Now, that's not to say that a notification shouldn't happen, because it's still a mainstream project, and therefore should go to the Mekong River Commission. So hopefully we can come back to that point. But through the Mekong Dam Monitor, we watch the Mekong floodplain and this mighty Mekong flood pulse and show how 20,000 square kilometers of the floodplain between Cambodia and Vietnam get flooded every wet season. And there's
Hmm.
a particular floodplain that kind of glows the bluest, or it's the wettest floodplain within the huge floodplain of the lower Mekong. There's just this very dynamic shape of that floodplain. There's one
Hmm.
particular that the canal is going to cut right through. It will bisect it east to west. And water essentially flows north to south. So water flowing through that smaller floodplain, and it's smaller, much smaller than 20,000 square kilometers. It's like 2,000 square kilometers, which is
Hmm.
still very large. It's going to hit that canal and not continue its downstream
Mm.
flow direction to the south or into Vietnam. That wetland or that floodplain it crosses three provinces in Cambodia: Kandal, Takeo, and Kep province, and then it extends into Vietnam's An Giang province and Kien Giang province, which are two of the Mekong Delta provinces.
Mm.
Um, and you can watch our maps and you see how water just moves down through that and irrigates the Mekong Delta all the way through the end of the wet season into December. This canal is going to profoundly change the flow of water through that floodplain. It's not the Mekong mainstream. Again, it's this really unique floodplain that provides a lot of benefits to both Cambodia and Vietnam.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really highlights. I was going back, I skimmed my review of your book, and what a big theme is kind of the connectivity of the entire Mekong and how
Right,
impacts compound on each other as the river moves through countries. And yeah, there are no, like, of course, there's a border between Vietnam and Cambodia, but not not a natural one necessarily. I mean, that's the case around the world, but
right.
this is very dynamic. The Lower Mekong, especially, I suppose, very dynamic and can be disrupted quite easily, I suppose.
Yeah, a lot of people think of rivers as a line, and and then when you think about the Mekong below Phnom Penh, it splits into multiple lines, if you will. In Vietnam, it's known as the Nine Dragons because there are nine channels that run into the river. But the river is much more than a line, particularly during the wet season. It's a shape. It's a wide shape, and it floods 50, 60 kilometers wide at some points. At the Tonle Sap in Cambodia, the lake, which expands 5 times its normal size, it's much more than 100 kilometers wide, and all of
Mm.
that's flowing. All that has a movement and a direction, and it eventually all moves downstream. So this this canal is going to change the shape of the floodplain, the shape of the river. It's going to create a dry zone below it. And a lot of that dry zone is in Cambodia, and it's in a part of Cambodia where Cambodia's best rice comes from. And if
Mm.
you follow the news like I do, Cambodia frequently wins the world's best rice variety. uh, and like in Vietnam in the Delta, Vietnam's one of the Delta is one of the world's most productive zones for rice production, rice farming. But the Vietnamese actually prefer to buy Cambodian rice because it tastes better. A lot of that
Mm.
rice comes from this part that's going to be impacted by the canal. And like here in the
Mm.
United States, when you go to supermarkets and purchase rice from the Mekong, it's always from Cambodia or Thailand. It's not from
Okay.
Vietnam because of the high
Interesting.
quality. So that
Right.
dry
Right.
zone is going to affect farming. And then the Vietnamese also, Vietnam kind of has wrestled with the concept of floods and floodplains over the last decades. But recently, they've embraced the concept of floods as a positive and productive force for economic development in the Mekong Delta. And about 8 years ago, they knocked down part of their own canal, which forms the border of Vietnam and Cambodia. It's a much smaller canal than what this will be,
Mm.
and allowed the floods to pass from Cambodia through to those two provinces I mentioned. And again,
Mm.
on these maps that we have, you can just see the water moving down through that flood corridor, as I call it, and keeping those like a huge portion of those two provinces wet. So those are major rice producing provinces for Vietnam. Those will be impacted as well.
Okay, so definitely something to keep a very close eye on. I imagine there will be much more news and discussion about this as the year progresses.
One more point I want to make about the
Sure.
Mekong River Commission and the notification. Like
Mm.
Cambodia made the wrong notification. They called the canal a tributary project. It should be called a mainstream Mekong project. It's not too late to change the style of that notification. And there's
Okay.
actually precedent for this. 10 years ago, the Lao government gave a wrong notification for the Don Sahong Dam. They called it a tributary dam. The international donor community actually came in and applied pressure along with Cambodia downstream to say, hey, that dam is obviously built on a channel of the Mekong mainstream. It's not a tributary. You need to change that. And the Lao government did. And when it did, all these protocols and activities came forward, facilitated by the MRC, and the outcome of the project was better. There was fisheries mitigation put into that project, and from what I read and talk with folks that work on that dam and communities around that dam, the mitigation is working. So that was a positive outcome of both international pressure, member country pressure to change the behavior of a MRC member country. I hope the same can happen with Cambodia.
So moving along from that, to take a much much more higher altitude view, you mentioned the Mekong Dam Monitor a couple times and the
Yeah.
maps that go along with it. What is that project, and kind of what's the objective of it?
So 20 years ago, when I was in grad school, it's when I first studied the Mekong. As I began to learn about the Mekong, I kind of got tuned into the Mekong watching community. And one of the big questions around the Mekong at that time was how China's upstream dams were impacting the downstream. And at that point, 20 years ago, China had a few dams operational. None of the large ones that it has today were operational. And then over time, particularly in, say, the Golden Triangle in Thailand and the areas closest to China's dams, the river started to change over the last 20 years. Seasonally, the river got lower during the wet season and the river got higher during the dry season. And then there were these times when there's extremely low drought, and folks didn't know why that was happening. There were other times when these like huge pulses of water would come down through the river system during the dry season, and there was no rain or there was no storm that could have precipitated that, and folks wondered why. So there's a lot of speculation. Is this dams? How many dams does China have? These dams are 1,000 kilometers away. What kind of impacts could they have? And all of that speculation lasted until our team launched the Mekong Dam Monitor in 2020. And it's an online platform that uses satellites and other forms of data inputs and social media to get the word out about dam impacts and also climate change impacts to the river system, and has a lot of explanatory power behind it. Essentially, we watch the reservoirs, not just in China, but 55 reservoirs, the largest reservoirs all throughout the Mekong system. And we use satellites to watch them weekly. We come up with a volume estimate, and we put that data together for a variety of uses. There's other data that we provide related to, how wet is the soil, and that can give us a sense of how much water should be flowing into the river. We watch the flood pulse, the expansion of the Tonle Sap Lake, and we think about how dams are impacting that. But we found out an amazing amount of information about how these dams are changing the nature of the river. And it's led to a number of benefits for the downstream countries in particular.
What kind of benefits? I mean, I know we mentioned, maybe unrelated to the Mekong Dam Monitor, but this dam in Laos, the plan was improved, I guess, through cooperation. What are some other ways that this is beneficial?
Well, we have that example that I mentioned about the Don Sahong Dam happened about 10 years ago. And it's an example of the region coming together to agree on a kind of a collective course of action and improving a project. And in a sense, the Dam Monitor does that in a sense as well. So the information that we provide about China's upstream dam impacts give the downstream a stronger hand in their negotiations with China to reduce some of the severe impacts of these dams. We also have an early warning service where we're watching the river in China for sudden releases or sudden restrictions from dams there that can cause the river to rise or fall quickly over a 24-hour period. And we give those alerts out 2 to 5 days before they hit communities along the border in Thailand and Laos. We actually did this over the weekend and on Monday of last week for a sudden rise and then a sudden drop. And we've had communities there tell us how now their boats are not being washed away from these sudden releases of water. They get the alerts, they tie their boats up, they bring their animals in from along the riverside, they harvest their vegetables and crops that are planted in riverside gardens, and it's saving them a lot of time, a lot of resources and assets too. We've issued like 75 of these alerts since we launched the Dam Monitor.
And you mentioned before we started recording that a new reservoir has started filling up in China. Could you
Yeah,
expand on that a little bit?
well, I talked about the MRC processes where a member country has to notify the MRC when a new project is going into construction or is ready for construction, or even the requirement is when a project is ready to begin exploration, they're going to notify. So China's got 12 dams now on the Mekong mainstream that are operational, and China has given no notification ever about the status of any of those dams. That China should share dam data with the downstream, and this is one of the gaps that the Mekong Dam Monitor is filling in. But China doesn't tell the downstream when a dam begins construction and breaks ground, doesn't tell the downstream when a dam begins filling. And we found one just last weekend as we were surveying the river with satellite imagery. We found that this 12th dam, the Tuoba Dam, far upstream in Yunnan, began to fill. And it had been under construction since 2019. We were kind of the group that let the world know that it went under construction too. And then I just got the word out on Twitter that it started to fill. And the minute that it starts to fill, the downstream impacts begin to accumulate. And you could actually see it in the data, how the river is running abnormally low right now as this dam upstream is filling. I mean, we're providing that type of information to the downstream. Ultimately, a government should do it, right? We're a think tank in Washington, D.C., talking to Twitter and the Mekong watching community. But I had confirmation from the Mekong River Commission that China indeed did not notify them of the dam's filling. So we're providing important service. The governments should be able to do this. They should be accountable, holding each other accountable, and kind of asking China to be a more responsible neighbor, and they are. But China has yet to follow through.
And this is kind of at the same time that there's been a lot of reporting here in Vietnam over the last couple of weeks that Mekong Delta provinces are dealing with very strong upstream saltwater intrusion. I mean, granted, it is very hot and dry here at the moment. And this is all a lot of complex factors, but certainly new reservoirs filling upstream does not help any of that situation.
Spot on. Yeah. I'm very critical of dams and their operations. I'm not necessarily an anti-dam person. Looking at the data, you can see that there are times where it's better to be operating dams in this way or that than the current time. This is one of those times. So last wet season was very dry in China. And when that happens, we know that the subsequent dry season, the river is going to run much lower. And I think that the Chinese are very aware of that. So when the river runs much lower, it's not a time to be filling a dam during the dry season because it's only going to exacerbate the problem. And during the dry season, the river should be low, but it doesn't need to be abnormally low. And Vietnam's going through these intense heat waves right now. The ground is starting to crack up and crops are starting to suffer. I don't want to say the river needs all the water it can get because this is actually the hydropower release season, and dams in China and all the dams in Laos can actually triple the level of dry season flow. That's a really bad outcome for the Mekong. It doesn't necessarily benefit the Delta in Vietnam either, for reasons we can get into. But the river should be low during the dry season, but it doesn't need to be even lower than it naturally is.
Right.
As a dam is filling.
Yeah, and you mentioned Laos, which I mean is of course a small, lightly populated country, but famously kind of wants to become the battery of Southeast Asia. I don't know if they actually say that or if that's just something that's been picked up internationally. But they have, I mean, the Mekong is the border with Thailand there, several tributaries, and of course Vietnam. Sort of something that doesn't get talked about here is that does help build dams there. But what role does Laos play in kind of the health of the Mekong?
Yeah, it's somewhat understudied. Laos has built two dams on the Mekong mainstream, and a lot of the media attention focuses on dams that are being built on the mainstream. And all the
Hmm.
while, the country has built out over 100 dams on its tributaries. And many of those dams are storage dams, so they have the impact like China's dams do. They're just on a smaller scale. They reduce the flood pulse, they bring the river level down during the wet season, and then they raise the level of the river during the dry season while they generate hydropower. When you put it all together, there are times when the impacts of those dams can be more impactful than, say, what China's dams are, or equally as impactful. These dams are built by Thai construction companies, Chinese construction companies, Vietnamese construction companies, as you said. Now Lao companies are starting to proliferate a bit, but by and large, these are foreign invested projects. Thailand's actually building three times as many as what China is, and that's something that's
Hmm.
not covered as much as it should be in the
Yeah.
media as well. A lot of
Okay.
fingers get pointed at Chinese projects. Now, the Battery Southeast Asia concept is, the fact that this is all foreign invested into Laos is a reflection of that Battery Southeast Asia concept. Laos 20 years ago just flung open its doors for foreign investment in these dams, saying we're going to be the Battery Southeast Asia. You can exploit all of our rivers for hydropower projects, and then sell the power to the neighborhood. An example of that is malls in Bangkok, of which there are more and more every year, consume more power than, say, far-flung provinces of Thailand.
Hmm.
Um, I'm serious. Studies have been done to show this,
Right.
and they do things like air condition the outside, and uh,
Yeah,
and
and I
this
can
is
speak
again
from,
this.
sorry,
Go
having been
ahead.
to Bangkok, they're also freezing. The AC does
Inside,
not need to
yeah.
be down that low either.
Right, right, right. And it's part of I mean, these malls entirely can be powered by a dam in Laos. The Lao government has kind of backed away from its rhetoric of better Southeast Asia. They don't say it loudly anymore. And a lot of that had to do with the dam breach that happened in 2018 in southern
Hmm.
Laos that killed scores of people and displaced something like 4,000 households. But that's not to say that the program of Battery Southeast Asia has slowed down. It's certainly not slowed down. And Laos, the Lao government would love to have foreign investors come in and build as many dams as they could.
Yeah, it definitely under discussed. I feel like I also did not realize that about the how active the Thai companies were there. So we've kind of talked
Yeah,
about a few countries individually, maybe heading towards a bit of a conclusion. So your book from a few years ago was named "Last Days of the Mighty Mekong," which
right.
sounds a bit apocalyptic, but my takeaway was that it wasn't. I mean, it was kind of like there's still work can still be done to make sure that it's not the last days, but so it's March 2024. Do you feel better or worse about the state of the Mekong than when you wrote the book?
Oh, I'm not very optimistic, and I'm
Mm.
typically an optimistic person. Just some of the tea leaves and the signals that we're reading. Countries just aren't the level of collaboration amongst the lower Mekong countries is not happening in a way that bodes well for the future of the Mekong's fishery or the robust agricultural production of the downstream. And climate change seems to be hitting the region more intensely than predicted. And so that's in weather changes as well as sea level rise. You know, by the time you and I are old men, it's predicted that under high tide and a storm surge, that much of the delta could be underwater, and that's a
Hmm.
place where 20 million people live. And so the question is, can you save the Mekong Delta? How much can be saved, and how do you save it? I've heard that some of the multilateral development banks are no longer going to be investing in an agricultural transition in the Mekong Delta because they assume that the whole thing is going to be underwater. That's not a good sign. The fishery of the Mekong, everyone should check out this new WWF report about Mekong's forgotten fishes. The fishery is the largest fishery in the world for a single body of water, and there are so many of the world's largest fish there. And we're finding them. The USAID Wonders of the Mekong program found the world's largest freshwater stingray in June of 2022.
I
I
remember
mean, this
that.
thing was like 650 pounds, and it was when there's a big fish story out there, it hits the media, and the international media covered it really, really well.
Hmm.
That was a good sign. But these dams are delivering a death of 1,000 cuts to the fishery. Fish can't migrate like they used to, and there are over 1,000 species of fish in the Mekong system, and they feed the people of Cambodia with something like 60 to 70% of their animal protein intake. The fish populations are going to disappear quickly unless dams are operated in a better way. Fish can't migrate through dams without proper fish passages, and maybe those don't even work. So I do think that given that there are like 450 dams built in the Mekong system right now, the intensity of weather from climate change and sea level rise, the countries need to get together and start working together quickly. Kind of domestic solutions aren't going to cut it. And even so, I'm not sure if the right solutions can come together in time. So, I'm definitely worried. I'm going to the region in a few weeks with more of an alarmist discourse than I typically do. But again, there's still time for solutions, and maybe much of the Mekong can be saved.
Yeah, I certainly hope so. I mean, I unfortunately share a lot of your pessimism. I mean, I've been following the Mekong quite closely basically the whole time. I mean, my blog I started when I moved here was called Along the Mekong. So it's always been of interest.
That's great, man. Yeah,
And yeah, it's hard to not feel bad. I mean, here in Vietnam, particularly, it gets all the downstream aggregated impacts through the
right.
upstream countries, and then there's a lot of issues. We don't really have time to get into all that. But domestic issues here with groundwater extraction and intensive rice farming and all of that.
Right.
And
Well,
even
when you go to the Delta, there aren't any young people anymore
mm,
out in the farming areas. They might be in Canton or some of the medium-sized cities, but they're all coming. The young people are coming to Ho Chi Minh to work in factories and office buildings, and that's the pull factor. So the Delta itself is in many ways being abandoned, and it's got a population of like 17 million people. I just think a lot of the youth there are reading the signals, and they're kind of voting with their feet.
and of course here in Ho Chi Minh City we have our own climate and environmental issues. So yeah,
Oh
I
yeah,
suppose for Vietnam it's perhaps the most existential of any of the. I mean, I know the issues with the Tonle Sap are quite critical as well. But yeah, Vietnam
mm,
is, I guess, being at the end of the river really kind of has the short end of the stick and all of that.
yeah, yeah.
Anyway, so I knew this would get kind of depressing eventually, but that's how it is. So other than the kind of this canal potentially happening in Cambodia, this new reservoir filling in China, are there any other big potential developments or anything on your radar?
I just want to leave folks with there's no shortage of solutions out there that can promote a mightier Mekong. For dams, what we're finding with the dam monitor is we can pinpoint, like, this dam caused this type of impact during week X of this year. And like, given the situation downstream, that was probably the wrong thing to do. So now if these situations can be forecasted, then the way dams are operated can be rethought and reconfigured. And so that's just a simple description of a solution. And the downstream and China are actually working towards that type of solution of a joint operation of the river system. So that is, that you get all the countries of the Mekong together talking about its future is definitely a positive sign. Cambodia's Prime Minister Hun Manet has reaffirmed the moratorium that the government put on its two mainstream Mekong dams, which would be the killer dams of
Mm.
Cambodia's fishery and of Vietnam's rice production. And the Cambodian government is, really placing high priority on Mekong conservation these days, bringing in a lot of donor dollars. Hopefully, they're spent well to put to good use for fish conservation, Tonle Sap conservation, UNESCO natural world heritage projects. But at the same time, like, this canal is coming down the pike. The canal
Mm.
doesn't really jive well with the discourse that I see coming out of the Cambodian government, which is one of the reasons I think it was entirely cooked up in Beijing as a Belt and Road project. But I, it's like a boxing match. And if we do this podcast a year from now, I might have a much more optimistic message of the way that the governments are acting.
Hmm.
I think an important space that is shrinking, though, is a space for civil society communities to be involved in the future of the river system. As Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand all kind of close the space for civil society. There's no space for civil society in Laos, to be clear,
Hmm.
but all the other countries are not widening the opportunity for local people to participate in the discourse of the Mekong and planning and things like that. They're missing the boat. The governments are really missing the boat. I mean, they're missing the key beneficiaries of who thrives off of the Mekong's fish and who thrives off of the Mekong's farming opportunities. And these are tens of billions of people. And by not addressing their needs, I think that governments are creating more problems for themselves in the future.
And sadly, here in Vietnam, it's a lot of it. The recent restrictions have
Yeah,
been on environmental NGOs, kind of the very organizations you would want working on something like this. But
indeed.
gonna not gonna get into that further on this episode, at least. Brian, thanks as always. Great to have an extended conversation on this. I'll include some links in the show notes to that WWF report you mentioned, and of course Mekong Dam Monitor. And
Yeah.
let's catch up again in a year and see how things are going. I mean, it's always fascinating. Again, depressing at times, but fascinating. Keeping an eye on the Mekong.
Thanks, Mike. Yeah, I look forward to that. And hopefully we get a chance to meet in person here in a few weeks too, while I visit Ho Chi Minh City.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks again. That's it for this episode of the Vietnam Weekly podcast, produced, recorded, and edited by me, Mike Tatarski. Thank you very much for listening. Please rate and review the show on your preferred podcast platform and connect with Vietnam Weekly on LinkedIn, Threads, or Instagram. And see you next week.